Today we're going to create this composite image together here in Photoshop using a handful of free stock photos from pexels.com, which is a great free resource for stock images to create composites in Photoshop if you're looking for that type of thing. Now, if you want to follow along and create this exact image with me today, you can download all of the files in the description below. Now, since there's so much to cover in this process, we're going to be moving through all of the steps pretty quickly. So if you're new to Photoshop, you might find this a little bit overwhelming. Luckily, everything that we talk about in today's video, I've talked about more in depth in separate videos on my channel, so you can go back, check out those individual techniques, so then you'll just feel a little bit more confident once it comes time to actually create a composite image. And now one last thing before we get started, if you really enjoy photo manipulations, composite images, and want to see more of these types of videos on my channel, then make sure to hit that like button down below to let me know that I should definitely make more of these types of videos. Now, once you're here in Photoshop, we're going to create a new document. I'm going to use a 2000 by 2500 pixel sized canvas with a 180 pixels per inch resolution. You can really make this whatever size you want, but this is what I'm going to use in this case. Click create. Now we'll have a new document created in Photoshop. The next thing we're going to do is go and open our images, but the first image that we're going to work with is actually the girl standing on the rocks here, which is this photo here. So I'm going to just drag and drop that into Photoshop. That image will load up into Photoshop, and then I'll just quickly convert it into a smart object since we're going to do some scaling with it later on. Now, before we go and add anything to the background, we need to cut out this girl from these cliffs because she's going to be our subject in the photo. Now, there's a bunch of ways to cut out images in Photoshop, but I'm going to use the quick selection tool just so we can create a selection nice and quickly. Now, I'm going to paint over all of the rocks here just because that is what we want to select. So as I paint, you can see that the selection is getting added around the rocks. I'll go around the bush here just a little bit, and then I will of course go over the model or the girl here, and just to get a general outline of her body like so. And then if you notice that the selection goes to a different area than you want, just hold Alt or Option, and now you can subtract from that selection and refine it as needed. Now, looking down in this area, you can see that there's a spot that needs to get removed, so I'll hold Alt or Option and then just paint over that to remove this little gap between her legs. Now, once you have your general selection active, we're going to make sure that this image layer is selected and then add a layer mask to remove the background. Now, this probably isn't going to look ideal at first, so we're going to go through and just touch things up with the brush tool really quickly. Grabbing the brush tool, I'll set my foreground color to white so that we're adding to our layer mask, and then I'm just going to mask back in any areas of the photo that I need. Now, as for the areas that you need to remove, I'll switch the foreground color to black, just rescale that brush a little bit, and now I can easily just paint out all of those unwanted areas. Now, as for the hair, I'm just going to set my foreground color back to white, and I'm going to just paint around the edges here to add back this hair like so. And then we're going to go into select and mask and then just refine that, because these little hairs are very hard to select with a regular selection tool, but with select and mask, it's pretty easy. So once we have our hair added back to our layer mask by painting white, we're going to double click on that layer mask to open select and mask. Now, within this window here, we'll go up to refine hair, and that's going to automatically refine that hair for us, and it does a really good job. So it will just save you a ton of time when you're cutting out the hair, essentially. Now, as for the rest of this outline, it looks a little bit rough, but luckily we can just touch that up with the brush tool in just a moment here. So I'll make sure my output is new layer with layer mask, click OK, and then now I have my duplicate image. With that layer mask still selected, I'll grab my brush tool once again, and then this time I'm going to paint black as my foreground color, and I'll just mask out all of this area around the outer edge of her body here that is basically just fringing left over. I'm going to set a hardness around 75% and then just begin to work around the edge of the subject like so until all of that fringing is gone. Now, there are a lot of different ways to deal with fringing, but if you just want a quick and easy way of doing things, just painting around your subject with the brush tool and a reasonable hardness, you can quickly deal with this fringing in no time. So I'm just going to continue to go around my entire subject until all that fringing is gone. Now, one helpful thing that you can use to streamline the process when working with layer masks is just pressing the X key on your keyboard, so then you can quickly switch between black and white as your foreground color. Just by pressing X, it'll swap those colors for you, so it just makes this process really easy as you are painting around your subject. You don't have to keep clicking on those colors. You can just press X and then you can add and subtract as needed. It's really easy that way. All right, so now we have cut out this photo. I'm actually just going to delete my original layer. So now we only have our layer with the updated selected mask adjustments. I'll double click this and call this to subject. And then now I'm just going to grab my move tool by pressing V, and I'll just reposition this down to the bottom of my canvas where I expect to place her in the image here. The next photo that we're going to add is this composite image 1. I'm going to drag and drop that into my project. Once again, I'll convert this to a smart object since we're going to be scaling it. This will help preserve the quality. With that layer selected, I'm going to just rename this to field, and then I'll bring this layer underneath my subject so that it sits behind her. Now I'm going to grab my move tool by pressing V and just drag this down like so. From there, I might just rescale it up a little bit like this, just so that we bring this horizon line of the field up a little bit further. We'll now just add a layer mask to this field layer, grab the brush tool, set our foreground color to black so that we are removing stuff from our layer mask. Then I'll just scale this brush size up, and I'm going to paint over everything that I do not want. So basically everything above the horizon line of the field. So going right along to here with a relatively hard brush. And then I can just right click and then set the hardness down to something like closer to 0% there. And then just soften out this edge like so. And we'll be touching this up later on, but for now this will work. Now I need to remove this little stump from the photo, so I'm going to just create a new layer above my field layer. Right click, go to create clipping mask, grab my clone stamp tool by pressing S. Now I'm just going to scale this down, hold Alt or Option to sample a little area over here, and then I'll just paint over that stump just to remove it really quickly. So now that that is in position, I'll just quickly call this layer to field clone. And now we're ready to go add our third image. Our third image will be the composite image 3. Just drag and drop that into your project like so. I'm just going to right click, convert to smart object once again, and then I'm going to drag this below my field layer so that it's going to basically blend the hills with this field that we just added in. So with this in position, we're just going to scale these cliffs just to fit a little bit better within the photo. I can hold the shift key just to free transform here, just so that the scale of the hills versus the field and everything kind of match up a little bit better. Now, as you notice on the cliffs, the sun is coming from the left-hand side of our image, but then on our subject, you can see that our shadow is coming over on the left. So that means that the sun is coming from the right. So that means we just need to switch our subject around. With our subject layer selected, press Command or Control T, right click and go to flip horizontal. And now that will just flip our subject the other way around so everything looks good to go. Now let's go and add our little castles to the cliff, or the runes, whatever you want to call them. I'll drag and drop this photo into my project once again. We are going to actually just cut out these ruins so that we have each tower separately on their own layer. So to do that, I'll grab the quick selection tool by pressing W on my keyboard, and then I'm just going to go and paint over the tower like this. And then with that tower selected, I'm just going to right click and go to layer via copy. So that's going to put this tower on its own layer here. And then as for the other one, I'm going to do the same thing, selecting that tower ruin layer. Once again, create a selection around this second tower here, like so. That looks pretty good to me. And then we're just going to right click and go layer via copy. And now we have our second rune on its own layer there. I'll delete my original image and I'll call this to small rune and large rune. As for this larger rune, I'm actually going to quickly just remove these bits of sky that are in the windows here. I'm going to select the magic wand tool to do that. I'll set my sample size to point sample, the tolerance down to something like 15. Make sure contiguous is checked off, and then I'll just click in those little areas. Hold the shift key just to add to those selections. And then now with those selections active, I'll just press delete on my keyboard. With that large rune layer selected, press Command or Control D to deselect that. And then if there's anything left over, I'm just going to go through quickly with my eraser tool and just remove these little areas as needed so that there are no blue bits left over throughout the windows. So that looks good to me there. I'll grab my move tool by pressing V, press Command or Control T, right click and go to flip horizontal because we need the sun to match the same direction coming from the left side. Now I'm just going to position this over here in the other side of the cliff, scale it down like so. And I want this to just sort of peer over the edge of the cliff. So I'm going to bring down the opacity of this particular layer, add a layer mask, select my brush tools, make sure black set to my foreground color, zooming in here, now you can see where the cliff actually ends. And then that way I can just paint over this ruin and I know exactly where I need to stop, basically, because I can see where the edge of this cliff is. Set my opacity for this layer back to 100, do any refining as needed here. And then with a higher hardness, something like 75%, I'm just going to once again paint along these edges so it gives it a more realistic look against the edge of our cliff. Perfect, so that looks good to me there. Now that is in position, let's go and add our next ruin. Selecting the small ruin layer, pressing Command or Control T, right clicking and going to flip horizontal. So that way the sun is once again facing the same way. Moving this up into position over here, I'm gonna make this one significantly smaller, but we're gonna follow the exact same steps as before. So once that is in the general area, we're gonna bring down the opacity like so. So then that way you can see the cliff behind. I'll add a layer mask to that small ruin layer. I'll zoom in. And then now with my foreground color set to black, I'm just going to mask out along the edge of the cliff, and I'm using a brush with about a 75% hardness, once again, just to give it a realistic look. Once you're happy with that, set your opacity back to 100%, mask out anything else that might be needed, and now we have our second ruin placed. Now really quickly, if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to hit that like button down below to let me know that I should make more videos just like this one. So at this point we have 2 ruins added. We have our cliff, the field, and then our girl. So we've added a bunch of images so far, and the last thing that we need to do is add in our sky. Now before we go and add the sky, we need to actually remove the sky from this cliff layer. So with this cliff layer selected, I'm actually just gonna rename this to cliff so we're all on the same page here. We're going to go and remove the sky once again with the quick selection tool. I'll go and just hold on that, get access to the quick selection tool, and then I'll go and paint over the sky like so, and then it will just quickly select that for me. Now with that selection active, I'm just going to add that to a layer mask. Since it's the opposite of what I want, I'll press Command or Control I to invert that. And then now I have successfully gotten rid of that sky. So we are ready to go and add our new sky into this image. Now I'll drag and drop my sky image into place just like so. I'm gonna position this behind all my other layers at the bottom of my layer stack. Grabbing my move tool here, I will just rescale this until everything fits properly. And now we have all the pieces in place for this image. Now, what I like to do when creating composites is first just get the general layout of your composite like we have here. And then now we're gonna go through each of the layers individually and start blending them to make everything look a bit more realistic. Because right now, it kind of just looks like a bunch of layers stacked on top of each other. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually work with this sky layer. I want to brighten this up just a little bit so it matches the vibe of the cliff here. So clicking on the curves adjustment layer, adding a clipping mask, so then that way it is affecting only my sky layer. I'm going to now just drag up the midtones like so, bring down the highlights so that we can still see the moon, and then that will just help to blend things in a little bit better. Then I'm going to change my color channel to blue, and I want to add some more red and yellow hues to the sky since that's sort of the vibe of these cliffs. And so I'm going to drag down on the highlights to add a bit of yellow, and then I'll drag up in the shadows just to add a slight bit of blue and give that sort of blue hour sunset type of vibe. Now I'm going to go to the red channel. I'm going to go to the highlights, just drag that up a little bit, and I'll bring down the shadows a touch so it's not too red, but at this point I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. Now one thing that you might have an issue with at this point, especially with the cliff actually, is that you still have some fringing left over like I have here. So I want to quickly touch this up right now, and we can easily do that with select and mask. So with the cliff layer selected, double click on the layer mask to open select and mask, and then in the view option, we're going to make sure the view is set to on black and then 100% opacity so you can easily see this edge. Now I'm just going to increase the smoothness a touch, bring up the feather a little bit, increase the contrast to make things sharp once again, and then I'll bring down the shift edge option to bring the edge inwards a little bit and then remove that fringing. So now I'm going to set this to output new layer with layer mask, click OK. I'll delete my old cliff layer, and now I have this new one without any fringing on it. So now that we've dealt with that fringing, let's go and blend in the field to this hillside, I guess you could call it. Now to help blend this a little bit easier, I'm gonna actually drag up the field layer a little bit. I'm gonna shift click the field clone and the field so that they scale at the same time. And then I'll just hold the shift key and scale up like this so that will stretch it upwards as you see here. Now with that field layer selected, I'm gonna grab my brush tool, make sure black is set to my foreground color. I'll scale that brush up and I'll set a relatively low hardness, something like 30% will work for me. Now I'm gonna go and mask out any areas along the cliffside here just to make sure that the grass blends into the cliff in a pretty reasonable way. The reason that I don't want to use a 0% hardness, for example, is just because it will give too much of a feathered look and it doesn't look very realistic in the end result. So in this case, as you can see, we have a kind of defined edge, but it looks relatively realistic of how it's transitioning from the field up into the hills. Now the next obvious problem is that the color of the hills do not match this grass. So you can either change the field to match the hills or vice versa. In this case, I'm going to make these hills match the grass. So clicking on the cliff copy layer, I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer, add a clipping mask. Now in the hue saturation adjustment option, we'll set the color channel to red. If I increase the saturation, you can see that's exactly what we want to edit. I will then go and make this favor a more green color, desaturate that, maybe bring down the lightness a little bit like so. So this is starting to look pretty good in here for me. Now, obviously we don't want this to affect the cliffs as well. So with that hue saturation adjustment layer mask selected, I'll press Command or Control I, invert that mask with the brush tool selected, make sure white is set to my foreground color, and now I'm going to paint over the hills like so. I'll use a relatively soft brush, a low hardness here, and I'm just going to paint over all the areas that I want to make look green rather than this red color that we had previously. And then now we can go and adjust our subject to match the background and the lighting a little bit better. So going to our subject layer, I'm going to first start by adjusting the brightness of her. So creating a curves adjustment layer, adding a clipping mask so it's only affecting the subject layer. Then I'm going to just bring down the highlights a little bit and then bring up the shadows so it softens things out, and then work with the mid-tone shadow range there just to further soften her. And now that looks pretty good to me there. So turning that on and off, you can just see it added a bit more soft contrast to blend with the rest of the vibe that we have in the field and the cliffs and such. Now I'll also go to the blue color channel within the curves, and I'm just going to add a little bit of yellow to the highlights, and then add some blue back to the midtones, and then go to the reds and just add a little bit of red to the highlights, and then add cyan to the midtones like so it doesn't look too overwhelming and obvious. Next, we'll go and add a hue saturation adjustment layer, create a clipping mask once again so it's only affecting the subject layer, and then this time I'll press colorize, and then I'm going to try to find a color that kind of matches this yellow in the cliffs here. So just a nice soft orangey yellow color. Now once you find that color, obviously this doesn't look very good, so I'm going to just double click on the hue saturation adjustment layer, and then within the blend if options with the this layer slider, blend if set to gray, I'm going to drag this up until the shadows start to lose the color from the colorize option, and then I'm going to just hold Alt option and then feather those shadows so that it only affects the highlights within the image there. And I'm going to drag that up even further like so. So then this way our colorize option is only editing the highlights within her dress. Now it's also affecting her skin, which looks a little bit weird. So with that layer mask selected, brush tool still active, set black to my foreground color, I'm just going to paint over her legs and then also over the rocks just to remove that weird yellow tinge that they had. Now the next thing I can do is just add a color balance adjustment layer. Once again, add a clipping mask, and then I will just blend in the mid-tone color range just to add some similar hues to what is already in our image. And then now the last thing we need to adjust is our ruins. I'm going to shift click both these layers, press Command or Control G to group them, and I'm going to call this to ruins. The reason that I'm grouping them is so then we can edit them together at the same time and just save ourselves a bit of time. I'll then go and create a curves adjustment layer, add a clipping mask to the group so it'll affect both of those layers, and then I'm going to adjust the contrast, lifting those shadows a bit, just bringing down the highlights a touch. This just softens everything out a little bit more, like so. Okay, so now we have our general blend of our entire image. So now we can go to our final step, which is adding global adjustments to everything at once. So with my top layer selected, I'm gonna go down to the bottommost layer here, shift click to there, press Command or Control G to group that, and I'm gonna call this to breakdown. So this is where all of your layers will be, and we're gonna go and apply global adjustments to this group so that we're editing everything at once. Now the first thing that we're going to do is edit the contrast. So once again, adding a curves adjustment layer, you don't have to add a clipping mask because there's no other layers below it. You're going to affect everything within that group. And then now we can go and adjust our contrast as needed. I'm gonna bring down the highlights just a little bit. I'll bring down the shadows to add back some contrast, and then play around with the midtones as needed, like so. I'm gonna then go through my color channels, maybe add just a little bit of yellow to the highlights, add a touch of blue in the shadows, and then the reds, do a similar thing to match those sunset vibes, adding red to the highlights, and then some cyan colors to the shadows. Then as for the greens, you can play around with that and maybe add a little bit of magenta just by dragging down in the midtones. Now the next thing I'm gonna do is edit all of the color hues using a hue saturation adjustment layer. I'll start within the reds channel, bring that to 100%, so then this way I can see exactly what colors are going to be affected. Now from here, I'll reset that back to 0, and then I can just adjust the hues and saturation and lightness of this particular color hue as needed. And then I'm going to rinse and repeat this process for all of the other color hues until I'm happy with the overall styling of this image. Now once you're done with the hue saturation adjustment, we're going to add a color balance adjustment, and this time we're going to actually apply an image to the layer mask so that all of these colors blend really nicely. With the color balance layer selected, we'll go up to image and down here to apply image, and then we'll set this to, as you see here, layer set to merge, multiply 100%, click OK. And now we have our image applied as a layer mask on this color balance adjustment layer. Starting in the midtones, I'm just going to play around with the color hues here to see what types of effects I can create. Again, I want to favor a soft sunset type of vibe. So just remember that as you are adding in your tones, just think of what colors you want to be dominant in your image and then favor those hues. So now I'm pretty happy with how those color and exposure adjustments are looking. If I turn all of those off, you can see the huge difference that makes. Now let's go and add some more stylized effects by adding some fog along the grass here. So creating a new layer, filling it with black, so set your foreground color to black and then hold Alt or Option and delete. Now go up to filter, down here to render, and then clouds. With that layer selected, I'll press Command or Control T, right click and go to perspective. Now I'm going to click on the corner here and just drag out like so to change the perspective of this fog. I'm gonna just reposition it so it's like lower down in the photo. Press the check mark to commit to that. Now I'm going to add a slight blur just by going to filter, blur, and Gaussian blur, making this relatively subtle just so it basically gets rid of some of the texture in there, pressing OK. Next we'll add a bit of a motion blur by going to filter, blur, and then motion blur. I'm going to set the angle to a horizontal angle, and then I'll bring this down so it's just a slight bit of motion blur like that. Now to remove this black background, we'll set the blending mode to screen, and then now we have this cool fog layer. Now to blend this into our photo, I'm going to add a layer mask like so, and then press Command or Control I to invert that layer mask. Now I'm going to open up this breakdown group, and I'm going to place it behind my subject. So I'm going to drag this down within my layers panel here, and then place it behind my subject right here, but then above all of the other background contents. Clicking on that fog layer mask, grabbing the brush tool, making sure white is set to our foreground color. I'm going to set the opacity of my brush to something relatively low, like around 15% here, and then I'm going to drag up the size and make sure my hardness is at 0% so it blends in nicely, and I'm just going to paint some fog in the field here, and then you can paint over the same area multiple times to make the fog look even thicker. Cool, so I'm happy with how that is looking. I might actually just add a little bit of color to it, adding a color balance adjustment layer, creating a clipping mask, and then adding a little bit of blue and cyan to that fog like so, just to blend it in a bit better. Now that we've added that cool fog effect, let's go and add the final edit to this image, which is going to be the dodge and burn adjustment. Now you can do dodge and burning in two different ways. The first way is using a 50% gray layer and then using the dodge and burn tools in Photoshop to actually do all of the dodging and burning, or you can use two different curves adjustment layers, making one dark and one bright, and then painting on your layer mask. That way is a little bit easier, so that's what I'm going to show you right now. With your topmost layer selected, create two new new curves adjustment layers like so. I'll call one to dodge, which is brightening, and then I'll call the other one to burn. Now with the burn one selected, I'm going to drag this down in the midtones to darken the image, and then I'll click on the dodge option and click on the midtones and drag up to brighten the image. Now I'll select the layer mask of each, press Command or Control I to invert both of those layer masks so that all of those adjustments are invisible. Now I like to start with the dodge adjustments, grabbing the brush tool, making sure that white is set to your foreground color, making sure the opacity is set somewhere between 50 to 100% here. And then now with a soft brush, we're gonna go and paint over any areas that we want to brighten within the photo. If you want this effect to be a little bit more subtle, you can press the 1 through 9 keys on your keyboard to adjust the opacity of your brush really easily. So I'm gonna brighten up some of these bushes here. I'm gonna maybe brighten up my subject a little bit more. And right now I'm just painting with a 30% opacity brush, just so all of my adjustments are really subtle. And if I want to add more to a specific adjustment, I can just paint over that same area a few times. Anyways, I'm just going to continue to brighten up certain areas within my image here. That looks good to me. So now I'll click on the burn layer mask with the same brush tool and white set to the foreground color. I'm now going to paint over the areas of my photo that I want to darken. I'll press 5 on my keyboard just to set that darkness to 50%. So now I'm painting with a 50% opacity brush, and now I can darken up areas in my image really easily this way. Usually what I like to do for these types of adjustments is wherever I brighten, I add darkening nearby as well. This just helps to add a bit of contrast to your overall image. And then lastly, I'll just go with an 80% opacity brush and then just drag around the edges to add a bit of a vignette here. You might love vignettes, you might hate them, but I'm kind of a fan. That kind of ties our whole photo together. I won't go over the cliff because I don't want to darken that too much, but otherwise this is looking pretty good to me. So turning those two adjustments on and off, you can see the huge difference that the dodge and burning makes to just stylize your photo and make things pop a little bit more. Now this hedge is kind of bothering me down here within my subject, so I'm going to go to my subject layer, click on the layer mask, grab my brush tool, make sure black is set to my foreground color, make sure my opacity is set to 100%, and then with a relatively high hardness around 70% here, I'm just going to mask out this bush like so. All right, and now with that we have completed our composite image. We've gone through a ton of different steps, but this is the final result that we've done. We started by cutting out our subject, added the field, the cliff, then the ruins, then the sky. Then after we blended all of our layers individually, we edited everything globally, so then we ended up with this final edit. Now I know there's a ton of stuff that we covered today, but if you followed along and you created this image, I would love to see how it turned out. So make sure to tag me on Instagram at burnwills if you decide to upload it there. Now, if you want to see me make more composite tutorials just like today, then make sure to hit that like button down below and let me know in the comments that you're super into this type of editing and you want to see more of it. Anyways, my name is Brendan from bewillcreative.com, and I will catch you back here next time for another new tutorial. See you then.